The coffee scalded her skin before she could react. "Maybe that'll teach you some manners," Officer Scott sneered, his towering frame casting a shadow over the woman he'd just doused in steaming liquid. The aroma of burnt pride lingered as much as the smell of the spilled coffee. For a moment, time seemed frozen in the quiet chaos of the diner, the stunned faces of onlookers reflecting disbelief, fear, and a hint of morbid curiosity. The woman stood slowly, shaking off her shock along with the dripping remnants of her morning brew. Her dark eyes locked onto the officer, unflinching, unreadable. "I think we should talk," she said, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the tension. Scott let out a short, derisive laugh, oblivious to the fact that this wasn't a suggestion. "Talk? Lady, the only thing you need to do is learn your place. People like you." His voice trailed off into a mumble as his smirk widened, confident in his authority, unshaken by the murmurs of the crowd. The woman tilted her head, her composure unnerving. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulling out a badge that shimmered under the fluorescent diner lights. The room went dead silent. "I'm your new boss, Officer Scott. Chief Helena Carter," she said, enunciating every word with deliberate precision. The badge in her hand was unmistakable, a symbol of power, of justice, of the position he had just attacked without a shred of hesitation. Scott's smugness evaporated, replaced by a flush of red that had nothing to do with the heat of the coffee. "You've got to be kidding me," he stammered, his bravado unraveling with every passing second. "I'm not," she replied, her voice dropping an octave. "And you've just made the worst mistake of your career." The diner erupted in murmurs as Scott stumbled back a step, his confidence shaken for the first time. Helena stared him down, her gaze unrelenting. The tension crackled like a live wire. "Let's take this outside," she said, her words more of a command than a request. She motioned toward the door with a calm authority that brooked no argument. Scott hesitated, the weight of his actions sinking in. The crowd shifted, unsure of what would happen next, but glued to the unfolding drama. The whispers grew louder as they tried to piece together who this woman really was and how this arrogant officer could be so disastrously ignorant. Helena turned on her heel, walking toward the door with a commanding presence. Without looking back, she added, "I suggest you follow me, Officer Scott. Unless you'd prefer to discuss your actions here, in front of everyone." The silence was deafening. The officer hesitated, sweat beading on his brow as he finally began to follow, his movements stiff and uncertain. The door swung shut behind them, leaving the crowd to speculate on the showdown about to take place. What would you have done in Chief Carter's shoes? Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their authority so blatantly? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As the door closed, sealing off the heated encounter, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of a confrontation that would shake the department to its core. Outside the diner, the cool morning air felt sharp against the heat of rising tensions. The parking lot was empty save for a few scattered cars, the perfect setting for a confrontation no one would soon forget. Officer Scott stood stiffly, his confidence drained, while Chief Helena Carter exuded a quiet power that made the space around her feel electric. Helena took a moment to study him, his crisp uniform, his clean-shaven face, and the arrogance that seemed permanently etched into his features. She had seen men like him before, emboldened by authority, blind to their own prejudice, and convinced of their untouchable status. This was no accident, she thought. This was a pattern. And it stopped today. "You've been an officer for how long, Scott?" she asked, her tone deceptively casual. 7 years, he replied, his voice tight, as though each word was dragged out against his will. 7 years, she repeated, nodding slowly. "That's plenty of time to learn the values of this badge. Respect, integrity, service. Tell me, do you believe in those values?" Scott swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. "Of course, ma'am." "Ma'am," Helena echoed, a sharp edge creeping into her voice. "You didn't think I deserved that respect 10 minutes ago. What changed?" "I didn't know who you were," he blurted out, desperation creeping into his voice. "And that's exactly the problem," Helena shot back, stepping closer. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Whether I'm your boss, a civilian, or someone you've never met before, your job is to serve and protect, not to degrade and humiliate." Scott flinched, but Helena wasn't done. "Do you think I don't know how this goes? How many times have you gotten away with this? How many people have walked away from you, feeling smaller, feeling powerless, because you decided they didn't deserve your respect. "Look, Scott began, but Helena cut him off. "Save it," she snapped, her voice commanding. "I've been on the receiving end of men like you my entire life. And I didn't claw my way to this position just to let it slide." The air between them crackled with tension. For a moment, Scott looked as though he might argue, but something in her unwavering gaze stopped him. He shifted uncomfortably, his bravado replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. Helena's tone softened, but her words hit just as hard. "Let me tell you something, Scott. This badge isn't a shield for your ego. It's a responsibility. And when you fail to uphold it, you don't just fail yourself. You fail every person who looks to you for safety, for fairness, for justice." Scott's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Helena took a deep breath, steadying herself. The fight wasn't over, but she needed him to understand the gravity of what he'd done. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "You're going to take some time to think about why you became a cop in the first place. Because right now, it's clear you've lost your way." "What does that mean?" Scott asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means you're on probation effective immediately," Helena replied. "I'll be conducting a full review of your conduct. And depending on what I find, your career might not survive this." Scott's face went pale, but Helena didn't waver. "You wanted to put me in my place, Officer Scott. Consider this your wake-up call." She turned to leave, but paused just long enough to deliver one final blow. "And for the record, I don't care who you are or how long you've worn that badge. Racism has no place in my department. Period." As she walked away, Scott stood frozen in the parking lot, the weight of her words settling over him like a storm cloud. He wasn't the only one who would be reckoning with his actions. Helena knew this was just the first step in a much larger battle, a battle that would expose the cracks in the system and force everyone to confront the truths they'd been avoiding for far too long. The diner door swung open, and a handful of customers peeked out, their curiosity overcoming their hesitation. Helena didn't stop to acknowledge them. She had bigger things to deal with now, a department to clean up, a culture to rebuild, and a promise to keep, justice for everyone, no matter the cost. The cliffhanger loomed as Helena pulled out her phone, dialing a number she hadn't called in years. "It's me," she said when the line connected. "We need to talk. Something big is about to go down." The phone call wasn't easy to make, but Helena knew it was necessary. On the other end of the line was a voice she hadn't heard in nearly a decade, Deputy Attorney General Michael Graves. He was once a trusted ally, a man who had built a career on prosecuting cases of police misconduct. Their partnership had ended on a sour note, but if anyone could help her expose the rot within the department, it was him. "This is a surprise," Michael said, his voice heavy with curiosity and a hint of wariness. "What's the occasion, Chief Carter?" Helena didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Michael, I'm about to dig into something ugly, and I need someone I can trust to help me navigate the fallout." There was a pause, the weight of old grievances hanging in the air. "What are we talking about here?" Michael finally asked. "Racism, abuse of power, and a culture that's been allowed to fester for far too long," Helena replied. "I've got an officer who crossed the line in a big way today, but I suspect he's just the tip of the iceberg." Michael let out a low whistle. "That's a heavy accusation. You sure you're ready for this fight?" "I didn't take this job to look the other way," Helena said firmly. "If I wanted an easy ride, I would have stayed in Chicago." "Fair enough," Michael said, his tone softening. "Send me what you've got, and I'll see how I can help." Helena ended the call, feeling a mixture of relief and trepidation. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but at least she wasn't walking it alone anymore. The next morning, Helena arrived at the station early. The building buzzed with its usual energy, officers and staff moving through the halls with a sense of purpose. But as she walked through the main floor, she felt the weight of 100 eyes on her. Word of yesterday's incident had clearly spread. Helena's first stop was the Internal Affairs office. She'd requested a comprehensive report on Officer Scott's record, and she wasn't surprised when it landed on her desk with a note. "You might want to sit down for this." As she flipped through the pages, her worst fears were confirmed. Scott's file was riddled with complaints, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and verbal abuse. Each report painted a damning picture, but none had resulted in significant disciplinary action. It was a pattern Helena had seen before, a system designed to protect its own, no matter the cost. Her stomach churned as she read through the accounts. A young black man stopped and frisked without cause. A Latina woman detained for hours over a minor traffic violation. A family terrorized during a botched raid. Each incident had been quietly swept under the rug, leaving the victims to pick up the pieces of their shattered trust. Helena's hands clenched into fists as she reached the last page. It was clear that Scott wasn't acting alone. This was a systemic issue, one that required more than a slap on the wrist to fix. If she was going to root out the problem, she'd need to take a hard look at the entire department. By lunchtime, Helena had called a mandatory meeting for all officers. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. As she stepped up to the podium, she could feel the weight of their skepticism, their resistance to change. "I'm sure by now you've all heard about the incident at the diner," Helena began, her voice steady and commanding. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear. This department will not tolerate racism, discrimination, or abuse of power. Not on my watch." The room buzzed with murmurs, but Helena pressed on. "I've reviewed Officer Scott's record, and what I found is unacceptable. But this isn't just about one officer. It's about a culture that has allowed this behavior to go unchecked." A hand shot up in the crowd. It was Sergeant Daniels, a veteran officer with a reputation for being outspoken. "With all due respect, Chief, you're talking about tearing down a system that's been in place for decades. Do you really think you can fix it overnight?" "I'm not naive, Sergeant," Helena replied. "I know this won't happen overnight. But if we don't start now, when will we? How many more people have to suffer before we take action?" The room fell silent, her words hanging heavy in the air. Helena scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of support. To her relief, a young officer in the back stood up. "My cousin was one of Scott's victims," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "She never filed a complaint because she didn't think anyone would listen. If you're serious about this, Chief, I'm with you." His words sent a ripple through the room. Slowly, other officers began to nod, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something resembling hope. Helena felt a flicker of optimism. This was the first step, a small victory in a battle that was far from over. As the meeting ended, Helena retreated to her office, exhausted but determined. She had a long road ahead, but she wasn't backing down. The system might be broken, but she wasn't about to let it stay that way. She pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote 3 words at the top of the page: accountability, transparency, justice. These would be her guiding principles, the foundation of the department she envisioned. But just as she began outlining her plan, her phone buzzed with an anonymous text: "Be careful, Chief. You're making enemies." Helena stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The fight had only just begun, and it was already clear that not everyone wanted her to win. Helena's eyes lingered on the text message. It was a warning, plain and simple. But from whom? Was it one of the officers in her department? Someone higher up? Or perhaps a member of the community who feared what her reforms might bring? The possibilities churned in her mind like a storm, each one more unsettling than the last. She took a deep breath and placed the phone face down on her desk. Fear wasn't an option, especially not now. If anything, the text only solidified her resolve. Whoever had sent it was scared, and that fear was a sign she was on the right track. Still, she couldn't ignore the potential risks. This wasn't just about her safety, it was about the future of her department and the people who depended on it. Later that evening, Helena met with her deputy chief, Marcus Brown, in her office. Marcus was one of the few people she trusted completely, a man with a reputation for integrity and a deep understanding of the challenges facing their community. "I've started the internal investigation into Scott," Helena said, handing Marcus a copy of the officer's file. "But this is bigger than him. We need to look at the entire department, every officer, every complaint, every incident that's been swept under the rug." Marcus skimmed the file, his expression darkening with each page. "This is bad," he said, shaking his head. "But you're right. Scott isn't working in a vacuum. If we're going to root this out, we need to dig deep." "I want to start with the officers who've had the most complaints filed against them," Helena said. "But we need to do this carefully. If we push too hard, too fast, we risk alienating the good officers and giving the bad ones a chance to cover their tracks." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. What about Scott? How do you want to handle him? For now, he's on probation, Helena replied. But I've already reached out to the Deputy Attorney General. If we find enough evidence, I want Scott prosecuted. He needs to face real consequences. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. You know this is going to make you a lot of enemies, right? I already got a text to that effect, Helena said, her tone wry. She picked up her phone and showed him the message. Marcus's expression darkened further. This isn't just a warning, he said. It's a threat. You need to be careful, Helena. If someone in the department sent this, they could try to sabotage your efforts, or worse. I know, she said. But I can't let that stop me. If I back down now, they win. Over the next few days, Helena and Marcus worked tirelessly, poring over records and interviewing officers. The deeper they dug, the more evident it became that the department's problems were systemic. Patterns of misconduct were hidden behind vague language in reports, and complaints from marginalized communities were often dismissed outright. One case stood out, a black teenager named Jamal who had been arrested on suspicion of theft. The charges were dropped after security footage proved his innocence, but not before he spent 2 nights in jail. The officer who arrested him? Scott. Helena's blood boiled as she read Jamal's statement. He called me a thug, the boy had written. Said people like me didn't belong in this town. I kept telling him I didn't do anything, but he wouldn't listen. Helena clenched her fists, her mind racing. Jamal's case was just one of many, but it was emblematic of the culture she was fighting to change. She needed to find him, to hear his story firsthand. That evening, Helena drove to the address listed in Jamal's file. The house was small but well kept, with a basketball hoop in the driveway and a neatly trimmed lawn. She knocked on the door, and a moment later, a woman answered. Her eyes widened when she saw Helena's badge. Is something wrong? The woman asked, her voice wary. Mrs. Harris? Helena asked. When the woman nodded, she continued, I'm Chief Helena Carter. I'm looking into what happened to your son, Jamal. May I come in? Mrs. Harris hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. The living room was modest but warm, with family photos lining the walls. Jamal sat on the couch, his expression guarded as Helena introduced herself. I know you've been through a lot, Helena said gently, but I'm here to make things right. If you're willing, I'd like to hear your side of the story. Jamal exchanged a glance with his mother, then nodded. Okay, he said, his voice low. But I'm not sure it'll make a difference. Nobody listened before. It'll make a difference this time, Helena promised. As Jamal recounted his experience, Helena's anger simmered beneath the surface. He spoke of being dragged out of a store in handcuffs, of the humiliation he felt as people stared, of the fear that consumed him when Scott sneered and called him a criminal. When he finished, Helena placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I'm so sorry this happened to you, she said. And I promise, we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. As she left the house, Helena's resolve hardened. She had the evidence she needed to take action against Scott, and a growing understanding of the systemic issues she was up against. But as she got into her car, her phone buzzed with another anonymous text. You're in over your head, Chief. Walk away before it's too late. Helena stared at the message, her pulse quickening. The threats were escalating, and she knew she was walking a dangerous path. But turning back wasn't an option, not when so much was at stake. The late-night air was heavy as Helena pulled into her driveway, her thoughts tangled with the gravity of what lay ahead. The threats had become more pointed, and while she prided herself on being unshakable, there was no denying the shadow of danger that loomed over her. Whoever was behind the anonymous texts wasn't just trying to scare her, they wanted her to back down. Inside her home, Helena sat at the kitchen table, spreading out Jamal's case file alongside a growing pile of internal complaints from the department. The pattern was undeniable, and Scott's name appeared too often to ignore. But what struck her most was the lack of follow-up on every complaint. Each case seemed to vanish into a black hole of bureaucracy, leaving the victims voiceless. As Helena worked, her phone buzzed with a new notification, a message from Marcus. It read, "We need to talk. I found something big. Meet me at the station first thing in the morning." The cryptic note unsettled her. What could Marcus have uncovered that couldn't wait until morning? Sleep came in fits, and when her alarm finally rang, Helena felt like she'd barely rested at all. At the station, Marcus was waiting in her office, his face grim. He held a thick manila folder in his hands, and his usual calm demeanor was replaced with a tension Helena had rarely seen. "What is it?" Helena asked as she closed the door behind her. Marcus placed the folder on her desk and opened it. Inside were documents, emails, and financial records. "It's worse than we thought," he said. "Scott isn't just a bad cop. He's part of a network." Helena's brow furrowed. "A network? What do you mean?" "I started digging into his connections," Marcus explained. "There's a group of officers who've been covering for each other for years, erasing complaints, burying evidence, intimidating witnesses. It's an old boys' club, and it runs deep." Helena's stomach turned as she flipped through the documents. The evidence was damning. Internal memos dismissing complaints, falsified reports, and even records of off-the-books meetings at a local bar. The group, which included several high-ranking officers, called themselves the Brotherhood. "It's no coincidence that Scott felt untouchable," Marcus continued. "The Brotherhood protects its own. If you come after Scott, you'll be going up against all of them." Helena leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about one bad cop, it was about dismantling a culture of corruption that had infiltrated her department. And it was clear that the Brotherhood wouldn't go down without a fight. "What's our next move?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Marcus hesitated. "You're not going to like this," he said. "But I think we need to go public. If we keep this internal, they'll find a way to shut it down. But if we expose them, they'll have nowhere to hide." Helena considered his words carefully. Going public was a risky move. It would draw national attention, put a target on her back, and potentially jeopardize her career. But it was also the only way to ensure accountability. "Start preparing a press release," she said finally. "I want to have a full briefing ready by the end of the week." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "There's one more thing," he said. "I've been hearing rumors that the Brotherhood has connections outside the department. Business leaders, politicians, even judges. If we're going to take them down, we'll need more than just evidence. We'll need allies." Helena's mind raced. Who could she trust in a town where corruption seemed to touch every corner? Her thoughts turned to Michael Graves. If anyone could help her navigate this minefield, it was him. That afternoon, Helena met Michael at a cafe on the edge of town. The usually lively atmosphere felt subdued, as though the weight of what they were about to discuss had cast a pall over the room. Michael listened intently as Helena laid out everything she and Marcus had uncovered. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You've got enough here to blow the lid off this department," he said. "But if you go public, you'll be making some very powerful enemies." "I already have," Helena replied, showing him the anonymous texts. "Whoever's behind this wants me to back down. But I can't do that, not when so many people are counting on me." Michael nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'll pull some strings and see what I can do to help. But you need to be careful, Helena. These people play dirty." "I know," she said. "But so do I when it comes to justice." That night, as Helena returned home, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She parked her car and scanned the street, but everything seemed normal. Still, she couldn't ignore the nagging sense of unease. As she unlocked her front door, she noticed an envelope tucked under the welcome mat. Her heart pounded as she picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a chilling message: "You've been warned. Back off, or you'll regret it." Helena's hands trembled, but she refused to let fear take hold. She stepped inside, locked the door behind her, and called Marcus. "They're escalating," she said, her voice steady but cold. "We need to move fast." As she hung up, she stared at the note, its words burning into her mind. The battle lines were drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. What would you do if you were in Helena's position? Could you stand strong in the face of mounting threats? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories like this. The next morning, Helena arrived at the station to find a tension in the air so thick it was palpable. Officers avoided eye contact as she walked through the hallways, their whispered conversations ceasing the moment she entered earshot. The department was on edge, and the growing divide was evident. Some supported her crusade for justice, while others feared the changes she represented, or worse, were complicit in the corruption. She stepped into her office and found Marcus waiting, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. Helena set her bag down. "What now?" "Word about the Brotherhood is spreading," Marcus said, handing her a tablet with a local news article displayed. The headline read, "Chief Carter's Crusade. Is the department in turmoil?" The article went on to detail rumors of her investigation, painting her as a divisive figure stirring chaos within the ranks. It was laced with anonymous quotes from officers who claimed she was targeting the department unfairly. "Damage control just became our top priority," Helena said, her jaw tightening. "We can't let them control the narrative." Marcus nodded. "I've already started drafting the press release, but we need to act fast. The Brotherhood won't sit idly by while we dismantle their operation." Helena's phone buzzed, interrupting the conversation. It was an unknown number, but something told her it wasn't a coincidence. She answered cautiously. "Chief Carter," the voice on the other end drawled, smug and familiar. "I hear you're causing quite a stir." Her grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "You can call me a concerned citizen," the voice said. "But let's skip the introductions. You're digging into things you don't understand. You think you're cleaning up the department, but you're just making a mess." Helena's stomach churned, but she kept her voice steady. "If you've got something to say, say it." The voice chuckled. "Here's my advice, Chief. Drop the investigation. Focus on the little things, community outreach, parking tickets. Leave the real work to the people who know how to handle it." "And if I don't?" Helena challenged. There was a pause, followed by a low, menacing laugh. "Then you won't like what happens next." The line went dead, and Helena stared at the phone, her heart pounding. She looked up at Marcus, who had been listening from across the desk. "Whoever that was, they're scared," she said, setting the phone down. "But that means we're getting close." Determined not to be intimidated, Helena moved forward with her plan. By midday, she and Marcus held a press conference, standing in front of the station with a cluster of reporters gathered before them. Cameras flashed as Helena stepped up to the podium, her expression calm but resolute. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "In recent weeks, my team and I have uncovered troubling patterns within this department. Patterns of misconduct, discrimination, and abuse of power." The reporters leaned in, their pens poised. Helena continued, "Let me be clear. This is not a condemnation of every officer who serves our community. Many of them uphold their oaths with honor and integrity. But there is a culture within this department that must change, and that change starts today." She detailed the steps she was taking: an independent investigation, partnerships with civil rights organizations, and increased transparency in complaint reviews. But she didn't name names, not yet. It was too soon to reveal her hand. As she wrapped up her speech, a reporter called out, "Chief Carter, are you concerned about retaliation?" Helena paused, her gaze steady. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. But I didn't take this job to play it safe. I took it to make a difference." The crowd erupted in questions, but Helena stepped away from the podium, signaling that the press conference was over. As she and Marcus returned to the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was still brewing. That evening, Helena reviewed more files, searching for the smoking gun that would bring the Brotherhood down. She was deep in thought when the sound of shattering glass jolted her. She rushed to the window and saw her car in the driveway, its windshield smashed. A rock lay on the hood, and a note was tied to it. She retrieved the note with shaking hands. "This is your last warning. Back off." Helena felt a surge of anger and fear. They were escalating, and this wasn't just a message, it was a threat. She called Marcus, her voice trembling but resolute. "They hit my car," she said. "We need to move faster." Marcus sighed. "We're getting close, Helena. They're trying to scare you because they know their time is running out." "Let them try," Helena said, her voice hardening. "I'm not backing down." As she hung up, Helena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The threats, the intimidation, the smear campaigns, it all pointed to one truth. She was on the verge of exposing something they couldn't afford to have revealed. And she wasn't stopping until she did. The morning after the vandalism, Helena walked into the station with a renewed sense of purpose. The previous night's threat had rattled her, but it had also steeled her resolve. If the Brotherhood thought they could intimidate her into silence, they were about to learn how wrong they were. Marcus was already waiting in her office, his face lined with concern. "You okay?" he asked as she set her bag down. "I'm fine," Helena said firmly. "What do we have?" Marcus handed her a file. "I dug deeper into the financial records we found. It's worse than I thought. They're not just covering up misconduct, they're profiting from it." Helena's eyebrows shot up. "Profiting how?" "Bribes," Marcus replied. "Kickbacks from local businesses in exchange for looking the other way on inspections, fines, and even criminal activity. And it gets worse. I found evidence that they've been shaking down vulnerable residents, immigrants, low-income families, people who can't afford to fight back." Helena's stomach churned as she flipped through the file. It was all there: payments funneled through shell companies, falsified reports, and even photos of officers meeting with known criminals. At the center of it all was Scott, along with several other officers she now recognized as members of the Brotherhood. "This is a criminal enterprise," she said, her voice tight. "We're not just dealing with misconduct anymore. These people belong in prison." Marcus nodded. "Agreed. But if we're going to take this public, we need to be airtight. No loose ends, no room for them to spin this." Helena took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "What about allies? Do we have anyone on the inside who can testify?" Marcus hesitated. "Maybe. There's a rookie officer, Taylor. She's clean, and she's been quietly collecting her own evidence. But she's scared. If she speaks out, she'll be a target." "Get her in here," Helena said. "I want to talk to her." An hour later, Officer Taylor sat nervously across from Helena and Marcus. She was young, no more than 25, with wide eyes that betrayed her fear. Helena could see the weight of the decision she was about to make. "Officer Taylor," Helena began gently, "I know this isn't easy. But you're in a unique position to help us bring these people to justice. The evidence you've collected could be the key to taking them down." Taylor fidgeted with her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen what they do to people who get in their way. If I go public, they'll destroy me." Helena leaned forward, her voice steady and reassuring. "You won't be alone. We'll protect you, and we'll make sure your voice is heard. But you have to decide if you're ready to stand up for what's right." Taylor looked down at her hands, tears welling in her eyes. "I became a cop to help people," she said finally. "Not to be part of something like this. I'll do it." Helena felt a surge of gratitude and admiration. "Thank you," she said. "You're making a brave choice, and I promise it won't be in vain." With Taylor's testimony and the mountain of evidence they had collected, Helena and Marcus prepared for the next phase, a full-scale raid on the Brotherhood. Working with Michael Graves and the Deputy Attorney General's office, they secured warrants for the homes and offices of the key players. It was a risky move, but it was the only way to ensure that justice would be swift and undeniable. As the team finalized their plans, Helena couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The threats, the vandalism, the anonymous calls, it all pointed to a desperate enemy. She knew the Brotherhood wouldn't go down without a fight. The raid was set for dawn, and the tension in the air was palpable as officers gathered in the briefing room. Helena addressed them with a calm authority that belied the storm brewing inside her. "Today, we're taking a stand," she said, her voice firm. "We're showing this department, this town, and everyone watching that no one is above the law. Not even us." The officers nodded, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. Helena could see the cracks in their unity. Some were clearly reluctant, their loyalty to the Brotherhood clouding their judgment. But it didn't matter. The wheels were already in motion. The raid began with precision and efficiency. Teams moved swiftly, executing warrants and collecting evidence. By mid-morning, several members of the Brotherhood were in custody, their shocked faces plastered across local news stations. It was a moment of triumph, but Helena knew it was far from over. Back at the station, as the evidence was catalogued and the suspects were processed, Helena received another anonymous text. "You think you've won? This isn't over." She stared at the message, her mind racing. Whoever was behind the Brotherhood still had resources, still had influence. And they weren't going down quietly. Helena turned to Marcus, her resolve unshaken. "We've hit them where it hurts," she said. "Now we need to make sure they can't get back up." As the day wore on, Helena couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The arrests were a victory, but the fight to rebuild trust, to root out the deeper corruption, and to protect those who had risked everything to stand with her, that fight was far from over. The aftermath of the raid was a whirlwind. News stations ran non-stop coverage of the arrests, splashing the names and faces of the officers involved in the Brotherhood across screens nationwide. Community leaders praised Helena's courage, while skeptics questioned whether justice would truly be served. Within the department, the divide deepened. Some officers expressed support for Helena's reforms, but others resented her for dismantling what they saw as the old guard. Helena knew the fight wasn't over. The arrests were just the first step. Now came the hard part: prosecuting those responsible, rebuilding the department's integrity, and earning back the community's trust. In the days following the raid, Helena met with Michael Graves and the legal team handling the case. They reviewed the evidence collected during the operation: financial records, recordings, and Taylor's testimony. It was airtight. "The case is strong," Michael said during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "But it's also dangerous. These people have powerful connections. They'll try to leverage every relationship, every favor, to get out of this." "I don't care how powerful they are," Helena replied, her voice resolute. "They need to face the consequences. The community deserves that much." Michael nodded. "Then we push forward. No deals, no compromises." As the legal battle began, Helena turned her focus to the department. She implemented sweeping reforms: mandatory training on bias and ethics, an anonymous reporting system for misconduct, and a complete overhaul of the internal affairs process. She also formed a civilian oversight committee to ensure transparency and accountability. The changes weren't without resistance. Some officers quit, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new standards. Others grumbled but stayed, their loyalty to the Brotherhood eroding under the weight of public scrutiny. Slowly but surely, the department began to transform. One evening, weeks after the raid, Helena received a call from Officer Taylor. "Chief," Taylor said, her voice steady but emotional, "I just wanted to thank you for believing in me, for making me believe that things could change." Helena smiled, a rare moment of warmth in the midst of the chaos. "Thank you, Taylor. You were brave enough to stand up when it mattered most. This wouldn't have been possible without you." As she hung up, Helena allowed herself a brief moment of pride. The road ahead was still long, but moments like these reminded her why she had taken the job in the first place. The trials of the officers involved in the Brotherhood dragged on for months, but the outcome was clear. With the evidence stacked against them, most pled guilty to avoid harsher sentences. Scott, the officer whose arrogance had set everything in motion, was convicted on multiple counts of corruption, abuse of power, and discrimination. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his career and reputation in ruins. For the community, the convictions were a turning point. Residents who had once feared or distrusted the police began to see signs of hope. New officers were hired, carefully vetted to ensure they embodied the department's renewed values. Community outreach programs flourished, creating a bridge between law enforcement and the people they served. Months later, Helena stood in the same diner where the story had begun. This time, she wasn't alone. Jamal and his mother sat across from her, their smiles cautious but genuine. "Things feel different now," Jamal said, his voice tinged with hope. "Safer." Helena nodded. "That's the goal. And it's people like you who keep me going. You spoke up when it mattered. That takes courage." As they finished their meal, Helena felt a sense of closure. The fight wasn't over, systemic change took time, and there would always be challenges to overcome. But the tide was turning, and for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. That night, as Helena sat in her quiet home, her phone buzzed. It was another text, but this one wasn't a threat. It was from Marcus. "We did it, Chief. We turned the corner." Helena smiled as she replied, "Not just us. Everyone who believed in something better." She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. The scars of the battle remained, but so did the victories. And for Helena, that was enough.